Kevin, thank you so much for being here today. And I'm really excited to dive in with today's conversation because we talk a lot about leadership on this show. We talk a lot about pursuing our goals, pursuing the lives of our dreams, but something that maybe is a topic that we've touched on indirectly without going all the way in is the concept of emotional intelligence and also leading from a place of emotional intelligence. How did you come upon writing this book and why is it so timely?
Well, no, Stuart, I appreciate you having me on. I really got into this lane because of some of the things that I was doing in terms of leadership development and working with a various amount of leaders, whether or not they were in the for-profit or nonprofit industries. And what I discovered was that there was a level of a lack of understanding of emotional intelligence and how it plays out in terms of how we perhaps may use our leadership skills or managerial skills or supervisory skills in terms of working with people. And so there was a deficiency in which I saw what in terms of people being able to gravitate to understanding the people that they were working with. And so I think emotional intelligence is at the forefront, and what really led me down the path as I was doing some work with leadership with empathy,
Mhm.
leaders learning social intelligence, really the idea of us being able to study those around us and understand those around us in which we work with, and how with our understanding of those environments, it makes the environments more productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know what those phrases mean, emotional intelligence, leading with empathy, but what does that actually mean for maybe somebody that's hearing this for the first time?
Well, I think for the most part, I think it's important for the listener to be able to say, how do I get in, allow my emotions, or how do I regulate my emotions? For the most part, in terms of some of the things that I'm doing, whether or not I'm a leader or whether I'm a part of a team. In some cases, I can give you an example of sometimes we tend to sometimes. When I was in school, Stewart, my teachers used to say, "Don't write how you talk." Because
Mhm.
some of the verbiage that we use in our everyday language not necessarily translate the same way on paper. I think when it comes to emotional intelligence, sometimes we're either saying things that we shouldn't say, or we're not thinking about what we're saying as it relates to the next person. So emotional intelligence allows us the ability to be able to regulate, or at least come to an understanding of how do I my emotional reactions counter interact with those around me.
Yeah. No, no, absolutely. And knowing that you are somebody that is in a leadership role in the church that you serve in, you are each and every day working with individuals trying to not only get closer to God but also improve their lives, and they're coming to you with their problems, their perspectives on their problems. And so you're somebody that's out there in the trenches putting this to practice each and every day.
Exactly.
And
Mhm.
and I'd love for you to maybe share, what does that look like when you are communicating with so many different people of different backgrounds, trying to help them towards a common goal, which in this case might be getting closer to God or just fixing an immediate problem in their lives?
Well, one of the things that I've been fortunate in terms of my career in ministry, I've been involved in ministry over 30 years, and I always like to say, Stuart, when I'm talking to people, especially when it comes to ministry, I always describe it as there's nothing I haven't seen. I always go, it's like seeing your favorite superstar singer backstage with no makeup on. When you
Mhm.
get out in the front, you kind of appreciate it a little bit better because of the fact that you've seen it maybe in the person in their most vulnerable moment. And for me in ministry, working with older individuals, working with younger individuals, working with different races, different genders, economic status, it allowed me to be able to go into scenarios realizing that people come from different parts of our society, but as you just pointed out, they're still trying to seek their relationship with God. And so when you put all of those people in the same room and we're trying to navigate to that same space, we can utilize those same principles when we're inside the boardroom, inside of a for-profit company, when we're inside that nonprofit organization. We're using those same principles because why? Because we have a mission that we're trying to accomplish. But how do we do it with all of those variables of people who come from diverse backgrounds? That's why there is an importance in terms of DEI, is because we're bringing people from various backgrounds together. We're bringing different opinions and thoughts, conservative, liberal, races, genders. We're bringing them all in, and we're saying, how do we work together? How do we, in the way with which we work together, is we understand one another. And so,
Mhm.
from my pastoral experience, even though I was the leader of a congregation for over 20 plus years, I've been involved in terms of leading two congregations in 30 years. I understood early on in my first stages of ministry was that in order for me to move the needle for our church to be able to kind of navigate ministry and change people's lives, get involved in community, I had to understand people. And so what I did was, Stuart, I spent time sitting on people's porches and talking with them and understanding them. I spent time, going to their birthday parties and
Mhm.
family reunions and, just, retirement parties. I spent time on living room couches, and I think when we take those components and then we say, well, how does that work inside of our business community? How does that work inside of our, our organizational experiences? It's about, again, being able to understand people, being able to understand that man or woman may perhaps have a family. What are the kids' names?
Mhm.
What's going on there? Did they get a divorce or have their family members been in a hospital? So it's about us being able to understand each other that helps us create a more productive community. And so again, one of the things that I'm fortunate with doing is working with churches. I work with about 100 churches throughout Ohio, from
Mhm.
Columbus, Ohio, all the way to Cincinnati, Ohio. And I help them with church conflict. I help them with pastoral searches. I help them navigate leadership type of navigation. And so, one of the things that I found is that it's easy for me to come in and tell you how to do something, but it's much better if I try to understand the context, understand the
Yeah.
people, and understand the dynamics. Because even when we talk about our great state, the dynamics of the state is a lot different depending on where you're at. So it's helpful
Yeah.
to be able to understand people.
Yeah, and I love what you said there because what I heard you share in your story is that you
Mhm.
took it upon yourself to go out there and meet the people and really get to know them and understand their come froms. And
Right.
to your point, somebody in Cincinnati is probably going to have a different perspective just based on the things in their community and their lives versus somebody in Lima, Ohio,
Mhm.
or Upper Sandusky or whatever the case may be. So, what I feel like I heard you say is we get to be leaders in creating the connection, creating the understanding with our brothers and sisters out there in the world because we say so. We can't wait for it to happen on our own.
Exactly. And what emotional intelligence does too is it doesn't just allow me to have a reflective thought process when I'm entering into the conversation, but it's also allowing me to become a listener,
Mhm.
because I'm giving that individual on the other side the platform to be able to solicit those thoughts, be able to say those things, and us being able to go, you know what, I understand. And even if I have a difference of an opinion, I still allow that environment to take place, as a leader. And so when we talk about, even terms of, again, going inside of an organization, I ask a lot of times managers and supervisors, are you creating an environment where that employee feels comfortable enough to share with you?
Yeah.
One of the great stories I heard, it was a gentleman who had led the movie studio Pixel, where we
Yeah.
see a lot of our animation come out of. And he said one of the things that they did, and I always admired him, Stuart, for this story. He said one of the things that they did was, he says every time they're getting ready to do a movie and they're getting ready to go into production, and he said when we're in our very initial stages, He says, we bring everybody in. We bring the animators in, we bring the
Hmm.
producers in, we bring the writers in, we bring the executive producers in. He said, we even bring the head of the studio in. And he says, we leave our titles at the door and we're in this room and we're in this big circle and everybody throws out ideas. And he said, what we found was when we left our titles at the door, we got a lot more productive activity out of everybody, and all the
Yes.
ideas and all the thoughts were flowing. But he says, excuse me, is we hinder it because he said when before he said when there was a chain, this guy might have been apprehensive because he didn't want to say the wrong thing, and that guy might have
Yeah.
been apprehensive. But he said we got the best product when we came in and everybody had an environment where they could listen to one another. And he says,
Yeah.
and then he says our customer base sees our movies are some of the best ones that's out there. And so I think when we talk about the issue of emotional intelligence, it's about our ability to be able to say, am I listening as well as trying to understand the people around me?
Yeah. And I think that this conversation is super important because our society is more divided than it ever has been.
Mhm,
We just got through the election and it was pretty divisive, not to
mhm,
make any side right or wrong, but there's a lot of us versus them out there
mhm,
right now. And particularly in organizations where we have people reporting to us, depending on us to come through, we feel a lot of pressure, particularly when we're in environments where, there might be some type of competition or competitor or even just groups of people who maybe want the same thing, but just have different
mhm,
ideas of how to get there.
mhm.
One of my all-time favorite quotes is, "It's hard to hate up close." And by
Right.
leaning into the empathy and the humanity of our fellow men and women out there, we're able to, because we say so, let those differences fall to the wayside. And in that example you shared, movie studio lets the differences of job title fall to the wayside so they can create some of their best work. I'm curious, this concept of meeting people in their humanity, where have you seen it impact people in your congregation, maybe people in your life outside of a leadership context?
Well, what I've seen is that it, for the most part, I think what it does is it triggers an individual to feel value. I think that's what's lost. And
Yes.
even when we talk about the idea of the divisiveness that we see in our country right now, I think there's a major feeling of I don't know whether or not I feel value from the other side. And so when we look at it in terms of even ministry context, one of the things that I discovered is, and I never forget this one, Stuart, years ago, this had to be about almost 10, 15 years ago, just a little bit more. I had several leaders who I just felt like were perhaps maybe kind of not as involved, not as, in terms of doing some of the things that they probably should have been doing. And I was reevaluating whether or not they should stay in that role. And I never forget my wife coming to me and she said, you know what? Maybe you should just take the time to just have a conversation with them to see what's on their mind
Mhm.
before you make that decision. And I took her advice, and I went and I talked with this couple, and it turns out that they really did want to get involved. They really did have a great love for God, but they didn't feel as though there was a value there. And so when
Mm.
we leaned in, and which here I was thinking that we were doing everything that was right in terms of making them feel valued. I discovered there were some things that maybe we could have done better. And so
Mhm.
after we had that conversation, I mean, from that point to the current day, I mean, this couple was they're rock stars in ministry. And I always have gone back to even my wife and said, thank you for sharing that because I was about to make a decision because I thought that maybe perhaps this is where we got apart our ways in terms of some of the things that they were doing. But because I leaned in and I listened and I understood that there was a misunderstanding of what was the perception of value,
Mhm.
it changed the dynamics. It changed not only their contribution to ministry, but the things in which they did that made an impact. and we
Yeah,
wouldn't have that. The church wouldn't have had that impact, or at least that isolated impact from that family had we not had that conversation. So I think, us being able to listen to one another, understand one another, and even being able to disagree agreeably, has some
sure.
value in it.
So I want to take what you just said and really drill down on something. At the end of the day, are you saying that what emotional intelligence and leading with empathy is about making sure the other person feels valued?
It's about making sure that they feel valued, but it's also taking time to be able to understand that individual.
Mhm.
Again, I think when we look at our organizations today, one of the things that I'm seeing a lot of companies do, Stuart, is they are finding value in the fact of taking time to understand their employees, because they
Sure.
understand it's getting them closer to the mission which they're trying to accomplish. And so, in times past, people led organizations with kind of a top down kind of perspective, meaning that I told you to do this, it's your job to do it, you get paid to
Yep.
do it. And
Yep.
even from a ministry perspective, we take the same thing. You're supposed to love God, do it anyway. But little did we take the time to really understand who that person was, and by us being able to understand people and being able to reflectively care about them, that they're maybe perhaps they're coming to work and I didn't realize they're going through a divorce. And maybe that
Sure.
was impacting their productivity, or maybe perhaps they're having the challenges with their kids. And so, as a leader, I said, "Hey, why don't you take some time off or go home early and attend to some family matters?" Those levels of lean ins, I think, show that emotional intelligence is taking place in the fact that we are caring about the individual, and that individual is feeling that concern, and they become a more productive citizen.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And thank
Mhm.
you for expanding upon that for the listeners. Something I would love to get your perspective on, not only as somebody in a leadership role, but somebody who is leading a congregation currently. We're talking a lot about taking it upon ourselves to do the work to, in a lot of ways, extend the olive branch of getting to know the people in our lives. But knowing that we are in divisive times, I feel like there's a lot of fear and apprehension that,
Mhm.
as much as we're talking about making sure folks feel valued, making sure they feel understood, I think there's a lot of fear that we ourselves won't feel valued or understood or even received if we're the ones reaching out and it's going unreciprocated, if that makes sense.
We can see that even in the Bible. I mean, we can see numerous amount of stories, especially with Jesus and the disciples, where even Christ said, "I want you to go out two by two." And he says, and if they, hopefully they receive you, but if they don't receive you, shake the sand off your sandals and keep going. I
Mhm.
mean, I think there's an intentionality that has to take place in terms
Sure.
of us engaging in people's lives, especially when we use the ministry concept, especially when it comes to people we don't know. I mean, because
Yeah.
it becomes easy. I remember in the early days when I first, I'm going back about 30 plus, Stuart, when I first started preaching. And I used to get asked the question all the time. I said, "Man, is it easy to preach in front of people you know, or is it easy to preach in front of people you don't know?" And the natural response was, preach in front of people that you know. I mean, how can I turn down an amen from my mother? I mean, she's not gonna think it's a bad sermon. I mean,
Shout
it
out to
probably
mom.
exactly. It could have been a terrible sermon. She's gonna say amen. So the natural instinct is, oh, I can relate to people that I know better. But I used to tell people it was the opposite. I would tell them, Stuart, that I actually enjoyed preaching to people who I didn't know. And
Mhm.
I remember getting a question from somebody, and they said, "Well, why is that?" I said, "Because I don't know. I'm gonna get in my car, go home, and probably never see him again." So it's kind of like Michael Jackson or Diana Ross or Mariah Carey. Hey, you might not like the song, but hey, I'm going to my place, you're going to your place. It's all over with. So, but I think when we talk about engaging individuals, we have to relatively go. There are sometimes going to be moments when I have to go into territory that is uncharted, and I
Mhm.
think emotional intelligence gives us that ability. to say me and you might have grown up in two different areas of the world, but it doesn't mean that I can't have some level of concern about what's transcending in your life just as much as you say that
Yeah.
about mine. We may have voted differently, you know, we may have different economics, we may have different races, different genders, but it doesn't mean that I can't be concerned or care about what lies on the other side inside of your life, because if I care about you, then I care about those things transcending in your own life.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I just want to say, zooming this out a little bit more and thinking just in like the broader personal development space, which is obviously what this podcast is a part of, we have to get outside of our comfort zone if we want to create any type of change in our lives,
Definitely.
whether that's in our families, in our communities, in our places of worship,
Mhm,
or even in the government, if that's
mhm,
what you feel called to do. And so
mhm.
I loved what you said about, in a lot of ways, going outside of your comfort zone and getting used to, preaching in front of people you don't know, and then taking that experience and just compounding upon it over and over again.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and obviously you can't share names probably, but any examples of just unbelievable wins or successes in any of the congregations you've been a part of for people inhabiting a practice of emotional intelligence in their lives?
Well, you know, one of the examples, maybe there's several examples, but one that really comes to my mind was 2 summers ago. We decided to do a Bible study. It was a 12-week Bible study with a church. Our church is in an urban area, and this church is in a suburban area. And we decided to really come together and say we wanted to do a Bible study that had to look the to look at the biblical components of how we even worship and come together, given the fact that there may have been some racial differences.
Hmm.
And so we wanted, and so part of the Bible study in which we did, it opened us up to talk about certain topics that might be in the hot button. You know, even when you look at our society today, but we wanted to look at them from a Christian perspective. And we
Sure.
wanted to, because that's what really was the common ground for everybody in the room. And so what we found was that it did allow us to be able to hear different types of thoughts that maybe perhaps would not have come up had we not created that environment. I think there were some thoughts that would came out from certain circles that were probably something that was typical within that circle, but never expanded out in terms of a conversation. And so I thought it was a win because I thought it brought together a group of people who would normally not have been together, except for the fact that they had in common their relationship with Christ, and it
Yeah.
allowed a level of discussion to take place that normally would not have taken place again if not because of the relationship with Christ.
Yep. And you know what? At the end of the day, we're all God's children, right?
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Well, and again, going to the essence of emotional intelligence, one of the things I said to the group at the very beginning was we shouldn't be afraid to have good conversation.
mhm,
And I think the world in which we live in has made us afraid of being able to say certain things. And I don't think that, necessarily you want to say things that are divisive, but I
sure.
think we shouldn't be afraid to speak from our what's transcended inside of our experience.
Mhm.
And I think, from a societal perspective, we're getting to a place where we're like, I don't want to hear that. I don't want to hear that. And again, I think that's depleting emotional intelligence. I think we should be in a world in which we go, hey, it's okay to talk about some things and still love one another.
Yeah, and, at the end of the day, everybody, it is a choice. Like, it is a
Mhm.
choice to treat, the people in our communities, especially those that we have differing opinions from, with dignity, with respect, and as you said before, like, respectfully disagree. Yep.
Well, and the second story I was going to say too was I can remember last year I was in Costa Rica and I was at a congregation and everything was in Spanish and I'm not fluent in Spanish. I could pick up some language, but not a lot,
Sure.
not enough to really hold a strong conversation. but I'm in this worship service and I'm going, okay, I know that song. It's in Spanish, but but we've sung that before. And it was interesting because the pastor got up and preached, and he was a really nice guy, and we got to become great good friends. And but I didn't speak Spanish, and he didn't speak English, and so we had an interpreter throughout the time we were together. But as soon as he was done preaching, I was one of the first people he came up to, and he said, "What was that?" I mean, no, he said, "Did you enjoy that sermon?" And I said, "I got to be honest with you, I didn't know what you said, but I said, but I could feel the presence of God in the room, and I could feel the presence of God in your ability of how you are articulating." And I said, I'm sure that was an awesome word, And he just smiled. And so that again, I think, was my ability to lean in, even though there was this gigantic language barrier. My ability to still lean in and say there was something I can get out of this. And but for him to even be concerned, how did you like it, knowing that I didn't speak the language?
And I love that you shared that because I actually think this is a great segue for the next thing I wanted to ask you. We're talking a lot about emotional intelligence with our interpersonal relationships, the relationships with others. It also matters that we practice emotional intelligence with ourselves. Like in that story you just shared, you could have absolutely made yourself wrong for not knowing Spanish, not really being able to know word for word what was being said, but allowing yourself to just choose a place of acceptance and allow yourself to be in the moment and
Correct.
experience the energy. You created that experience for yourself. And what I wanted to ask you is, obviously we're talking about this book that is coming out that I hope all the listeners take the opportunity to grab, and we'll make sure the links are made available in the show notes below. But you've also written a lot of other books, and so many people want to write one book one time in their lives, but are, either paralyzed by fear or they give into the imposter syndrome. What has the role of being emotionally intelligent, practicing emotional intelligence tools with yourself done for you in being such a prolific author?
Well, no, and I appreciate you saying that. For me, I think it's been one who I've learned over the last 10 years how to be a better listener, in terms of even my own marriage, as a parent, as a family member, as a pastor, all the dynamics inside of my life. I learned how to listen, and it also has taught me how to have that level of empathy. I was sharing with someone earlier today, and they were asking about some of the work that me and my wife were doing in the community, and I said it's because of my empathy. It's because of
Mhm.
me being able to understand that there are certain things that we should be involved in because we care about humankind. There should be a level of give back. And so, in my relationship with God, Stewart, it's caused me to always pause and be grateful and have a spirit of gratitude about some of the things that transpired in my life. And so, because of that gratitude, my expression becomes, how do I give back? How
Mm.
can I can become a better person? Maybe it's not that Kevin has the solutions, but maybe Kevin can show his level of support, or concern, or care, or some type of give back, that allows people to realize that this person really is trying to be the best of who they are. And so that's pretty much for me, and it's helped me as over the years, in terms of writing. I remember, someone said this to me early on. They said, "Man, the hardest book to write is your first book."
Mhm.
And it really is, because it's the confidence level. It's because we can't believe, can I actually do this? And my confidence was built when I was working on my dissertation. I can
Sure.
remember, when the first day of us in orientation, when I was in a doctoral class, and the dean of the school was talking about, hey, my dissertation was about 350 pages, and I'm like, oh man, I can't do no 350 pages. I said maybe I'm in the wrong place. But then when I continued on in the program and I understood that we wasn't sitting down at a computer and spitting off 350 pages, within about 30 days, that we were really gathering information and putting it together. We were doing research and we were doing the different types of things that it takes to put together a dissertation. I began to understand the concept of writing, and so that's what gave me the confidence to go, hey, you don't necessarily have to spew out this information by one sitting. You're really just doing the work and you're gathering and you're putting it together, and with a little editorial help and spell check, you're able to
Hmm.
to get to a completed piece. And so that's what helped me along the way, grab the confidence in terms of writing.
I love that. I love that. I'm hearing you say that it's piece by piece, but it's also being connected to your purpose for why you are creating what it is
Yeah.
you're creating.
Yeah. Everything I've ever written it's been inspired from somewhere. It's either been inspired by a sermon, it's been inspired by conversations, or has been inspired by something personal in my life. It's been inspired by some type of love, emotional intelligence. The last book I written was The Deacon's Daughter, and it was more of a storytelling. I love historical pieces. That book took place in the 1950s, but I wanted it to be a love story, but I wanted to be a love story that had a twist to it. And
Hmm.
so everything that I've ever put together, even in terms of Little Charles, it was a child book. um, when I was a kid, store people, my dad's friends, when they met me for the first time, they didn't know my first name, so they used to call me Little Charles.
Hmm.
And so I wanted to do a children's book during a time period in America where they were trying to pull a lot of books off the shelf. I said I want to put a good book on the shelf. And I want that little boy to be, somewhat of a symbolic representation of myself when I was a kid. So everything that I've ever done always has some type of meaning and inspiration.
I love that. I love that. And specifically for the authors that might be listening to this book, or I should say the aspiring authors, you already said the first book's the most difficult. What is your advice to them to get that first manuscript completed?
What I tell potential authors, is to first begin by having that thought, not being afraid to put it down on paper. At least your initial thoughts. What is it that you want to talk about? What is it that you want to say to whatever type of listener? What pathway, whether or not it's a fiction or nonfiction, self help, Christian, business, whatever it is that you want to do, put it down on paper, and then I would say create an outline in
Hmm.
terms of the subject matter. And then once you have your outline, write towards each particular item on your outline. And before you know it, you would have composed a level of writing that then you can go back to, and you can maybe add on a little bit, and then you bring in perhaps an editor to really clean it up. But not, my first advice would be, do not be afraid to put your thoughts down on paper. Put them down on paper, and allow your heart to take you from there.
I would even argue, folks, like have the courage to express yourself
That's
because
it.
you don't have to show the work to anybody, although I hope you do. But there's
Yeah.
so many folks out there that I know have the imposter syndrome that prevents them from writing because of
Yeah.
whatever story they're making up. But you owe it to yourself to get it out there and to at least
That's right.
have that expression.
Well, again, for me, every book, man, was inspired from somewhere. The first book that I ever wrote, "Why Do Men Hide Behind Trees," was actually from a sermon that I preached on Father's Day, almost about
Mm,
25 years ago. And
wow.
and really, what it was I was coming on that particular Sunday to talk to men, and for the most part, it was about 90% of the people out there were women. And I was talking about men and some of the things that, hold us back from being the man that God's called us to be. And so I said, you know what, God, I don't want this. This was, I thought it was a great message, and I don't want it to kind of fall down from there. And so it led me to be inspired to kind of develop it even more so. And that became my first book, And so everyone has an inspiration that's inside of them. And as you just pointed out, don't be afraid to say it. I think when you realize that the world needs to hear your voice or hear your story, it will give you a level of confidence that says that you can do it.
Yeah. And folks, I want you to hear what we're saying. Kevin, you've written over a dozen books at this point,
Hmm.
and I am approaching 100 episodes on this podcast. Nobody gave us permission to do these two things creatively except for
That's right.
ourselves,
That's
right?
right. Yeah. Well, and again, I appreciate what you just said. I think it's about us being able, as the disciples were in the boat, you know, very few people, if they forget, 11 other disciples stayed in the boat. You know,
Yeah.
one one decided to say, "I'm going to have the courage to get out the boat," and so. I think when me and you grab the courage to say, you know what, this looks like it may be something that may be difficult and others may think in terms of impossible, that we ask God to give us the courage to get out the boat, and so I get excited. I got to be honest with you, Stuart. I get excited now, because I'll have 2 or 3 books inside of me that I'm already planning, for the future. I mean, we already have one that we're going to be marketing in the late spring of 25, and that's something that's really, really dear to my heart. And so, again, I think it's always about, God give us the courage to get out the boat.
I love it. I love
Mhm.
it. I mean, we could continue this thread of the conversation for sure, but in the interest of time, I do want to make sure everybody knows exactly where to pick up your books, not only leading with emotional intelligence, but also just connect with you offline. Where is the best way for them to do so?
They can connect with me. You can always go to my website, www.kevinhairston.org. And it'll give you a glimpse of all of the books that are offered. Also, with the latest book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence, it does come with an instructor's guide and a participant guide for those. We've offered that book to a number of coaches and HR personnel who love to do training on their own. I do training, but there's been people who've asked us, can they utilize the material? And so I developed it in a way that anyone can purchase it and utilize it within their own organizations. But I would love to be able to hear from people, even in terms of email, KS Hairston at aspiringlearninggroup.com, just to get your thoughts and perspectives. Maybe perhaps there's something that we can do in the future that helps out people even more so.
Absolutely. And folks, be sure to pick up the book, Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And also, as Kevin said, reach out to him with feedback, questions. I mean, these are absolutely conversations worth having because you don't know who they're going to impact, quite frankly. And in line with this conversation, having the courage to take the leap and make the contact is how we unlock doors, whether it's for ourselves or for the people that we know and love. Kevin, we are about to wind down this conversation. I want to first acknowledge you for being somebody who I think we can all look up to in terms of following their purpose, being brave enough to get out there and actually figure out what his purpose is with his time here on this earth, who God created you to be, and also having the audacity to put your pen to paper and share your thoughts with the world, trusting that whoever gets to hear them is going to and is going to be impacted by them as a result. And so I want to thank you for being on the show today.
No, thank you, Stuart. I want to say thank you very much for the invitation. As always, I enjoy our conversations together, and I'm thankful for the work that you're doing. And I appreciate you leaning inside of your calling and allowing people to be able to hear great messages, hopefully like this one.
Thank you so much. And the final question I have for you, I ask every guest on the show, What are you acknowledging yourself for today?
I would say acknowledging myself for today. I guess I would describe if I had to say some type of acknowledgement. I'm thankful for the opportunity um, to to do and have done some of the things that God has allowed me to do. I enjoy being able to see people grow, be the best that they can be, no
Mhm.
matter what facet of life that they are in. And so I'm grateful. And if I was going to say I acknowledge the opportunity that God has allowed me to be in that lane. And I pray that not only does that lane expand, but that we have a chance to touch some more lives.
Absolutely. I love it. And I have no doubt that you will continue to do so. And
No,
so, folks, this has been another episode, Your Inside Track to Success. We will catch you next week with another amazing guest or message. We'll see you then.